Chapter 20 begins on page 395, and this has to do with our breathing, how we're making our faces, and just everything about what's going on with the muscles inside our body. As an overview, under the introduction, to me it's interesting to know that prior to 1969, we weren't exactly sure of how our muscles moved. Prior to that time period, they thought that it would fold like an accordion, but in 1969, they discovered for sure that a muscle doesn't move like an accordion or it folds up. Instead, it's going to lengthen or shorten depending on the type of cells that are inside that muscle. So we have to go back to our cellular unit, chapter 18, to remember that all of our tissue that we have in our body is part of our entire structure. So we are just a bunch of cells that are all put together. And specifically, this chapter is going to look at all the different types of muscle tissue and everything that's related along with it. Under the functions or the physiology on 395, please make sure that you're familiar. There's only 3 of them, but one of them that might not be one that you would think of is heat production. And our muscles are part of that's the function, one of the functions of our muscles. On the very top, I have a little interesting tidbit there. So it's muscle, fascicle, muscle fiber, all the way out to myofilaments. And I didn't have the little arrows that I could find when I was creating this, but this is on page 399, the left-hand column right above muscle contractions. So this is actually where I want to start this next part as we talk about all the little intricacies of inside our muscle cells. So we think of a big muscle, but we have to go all the way down to the myofilament. So these are all the different type of fibers that we have. Back on page 395, so muscle cells are muscle fibers. It just depends on their shape and what they're doing when we have all of those different types. So we're going to talk about the cell membrane, the fluid, and just the different types of fibers that are the strands that are inside of each muscle. The picture that I have here on this slide is on page 396. And this is when in 1969 that scientist discovered that the cells inside our muscles, I look at it as it kind of telescopes out. So that very center blue part, that's the myofibril fibers at the very end. It's easier to see it in your book. Each part of that muscle is moving forward. And all of these bundles, the fascicle bundles, if you're looking at the bottom part of that picture, each bundle is a fascicle. Each part can move out. It can move out. But think of how sometimes we have an ache or a discomfort, or maybe we know someone whose muscles aren't exactly moving like they're supposed to be. Think of those fascicles and all of the little parts that perhaps are moving or perhaps are not moving. So everything about this picture, which these definitions start on page 395 with the sarcolemma. So that's the cell membrane that is surrounding the muscle fibers. The sarcoplasm, so that's the fluid within the muscle fibers. The myofibrils are the slender strands that are kind of running side by side of each muscle fiber. The sarcomeres are the basic units or how everything is moving forward. And that goes from Z lines, and we'll look at those in just a moment. But even thinner within the sarcomere is the myofilaments. And again, you can see all of these definitely easier in the picture on 396 in your book. But these myofilaments, we have thick and thin, and we're going to look at those a little up closer in just a moment. but the definitions of the thick and the thin filaments are on the bottom of 396. And so the picture that is on the top of 397 gives you a little overview of the difference between the thick and the thin myofilaments within the sarcomere. There's also some other things that you can see on here. The myosin or myosin heads, these are also pictured here. So this is part of what is sticking out from the bundles back defined on page 395. So kind of take some page turning to look at all of these things that are happening within that fascicle or within that bundle of what's going on inside our muscle. Our muscle fiber is a part of, we think when that bundle of muscle fiber goes to move, what's inside that? This picture is what's on top of 398. So you can see a little closer there, the sarcolemma, the sarcoplasm, the sarcomere, and please make sure you know the definitions of all of those. But also you can see that there is the mitochondria. You might remember that from chapter 18. So that's the power that is happening within this entire bundle of everything. The sarcoplasmic reticulum there at the very bottom, just how that little network is happening within there. So please take the time to study this picture, look at all these definitions. For me, it always helps if I have a view of what I'm trying to grasp when I'm saying sarcoplasmic reticulum or those mitochondria, those little purple things that are floating around inside that muscle fiber, but just how everything is working together to make that muscle fiber move. The connective tissue, which you can see on page 396, so if you go back to that, there's always going to be parts of that as well. So these three terms of connective tissue, so this is on the bottom of 397, we had that bundle of muscle fibers, but there's parts of that fascicle that we need to identify. So each fascicle is surrounded by this connective tissue, and right in about the middle of the bigger part of that picture on 396, we have the epimysin, the perimysin, and the endomysin. So back in chapter 18, we talked a little bit about those prefixes, the root word, and the suffix. So endo, peri, and epi are ones that maybe that comes back, or you can look back in chapter 18 to get a review of what those are. You're going to have those in even more chapters as we go forward. So just these parts of the connective tissue, we want to make sure that we know that those are part of the fascicle that is within that strand of that muscle tissue. We think of muscles on a whole as being like what's in our arm. And in this picture here, we're showing just, this is what I think of when I think of muscle, not all those little things that all those pictures that we just looked at, right? But muscles and tendons and the aponeurosis. So all of these parts we have to think of also, but we always start every chapter with at the cellular level. So everything, all the pictures and all the terms that you've thought about, that's just within the muscle cell and the muscle fibers. And now this part will be maybe a little bit easier because you can kind of connect or see it a little bit differently. I want you to be aware of not only the origin, the insertion, and the belly terminology, but also just all the different types of muscles and tendons that we have. So on the bottom of 398, tendons, aponeurosis, reticula or retinaculum. So we can think of it as singular or plural. And then also the definition of the belly, the origin, the insertion. On page 399, right above the part where we started with the muscle all the way down to the myofilaments, is a term called what can happen when the opposite can occur, and that's functional reversibility. So the definition being there, we are going to talk about that when we look at some other type of movements here shortly as we move further through this chapter. A muscle contraction. So this is just when it moves. It has to, in order for a muscle to move, it has to receive some sort of message in order for it to fire. So first of all, please know the definition of what a muscle contraction is and how the myosin and the actin, or the thick and the thin filaments, just what they're doing in order to make that happen. And I know right now it just seems like a whole lot of terminology, but hopefully as we go through this next part, talking about how the muscle actually moves, that might bring you back to looking at some of those definitions. So there's a place where a muscle has to be told by a nerve that it needs to move or do something. This picture is on the top of page 400 that I have on the slide here. But really we want to look at pages 399 to think about that muscle contraction. So we just talked about that a muscle has to move, so it's going to change somehow. But there's a junction, or like a fork in the road, that this happens. That is the neuromuscular junction. So this is the intersection between the motor neuron, we can think of that of our nervous system, and our muscle fiber. In this junction, it's going to be told to turn right, turn left, perform, do something. But there is three parts of that neuromuscular junction: the motor end plate, the motor neuron, and the synaptic gap. So easily for you can see those easier on the top of page 400 than you can on the slide here. The definition of each one of those is on page 399, but again, the picture being on 400, so you got to kind of flip a little bit there. But I do want you to know how that motor neuron is so the nervous system is talking to the muscle fibers. It has to be filled with something in order to make that muscle contraction happen. So that is in the paragraph right above the excitation of the motor end plate under the neuromuscular junction. I want you to be familiar with what is happening, what is powering that, what's involved with that muscle contraction. So that's between the motor end plate, the motor neuron, and how it goes across that space called the synaptic gap. So again, use the pictures on page 400 to help you see what is actually happening as you're looking at those definitions. Part of also what is happening is that something has to be told that it's doing something. So it has to have a recruitment that is happening in order for something to go across that synaptic gap. So muscles are all of these strands all throughout our body. So this motor unit, the motor neuron, is part of what we want to think about right now. So how is that muscle fiber told to do, to contract, to fire, to do whatever it is? It's called an all or none response. So this is for one motor unit, and the nervous system is regulating the amount of power that is going to be happening. So for this thought, I want you to turn back and look at that picture on 396. Think of each of those bundles or fascicles. Each one has that networking of the yellow, looks like lattice on the outside. So the nerves that are there, each of those fascicles are being told by that sarcoplasmic reticulum what to do. So it has to be recruited, which is why one part of that fascicle might work, but then the next bundle might not. So it's not the entire muscle that is being told what to do. It's each individual bundle. So that recruitment is based on the need of what I need my muscle to do. If you've ever lifted up something like a bag of groceries and you thought it was going to be light and you're like, oh man, this is the one that has all this heavy cans or meat or something really heavy in there, but you thought it was going to be lighter. So not enough recruitment happened. And then likewise, we went to pick up something and we thought it was going to weigh 20 pounds and it only weighed 5 pounds. So that recruitment is that process that my nerves are being told by my brain, recruit this much of my muscle fiber, and perhaps it needs more, perhaps it needs less, or maybe it was just that right amount. So the recruitment of the all or none response is what we're talking about with each of those muscle fibers, not necessarily for the entire muscle itself. But in order for that recruitment to happen, there has to be energy. And we think of, I have to feed my body something so that my muscles can work. So there is energy that is needed for a muscle contraction. And this is that ATP, a universal unit of energy. So this is on page 400 where we're looking at this slide. And it goes into a little bit further explanation of besides this ATP energy that's produced by the power of the cell, the mitochondria, we also need to have glucose and oxygen in order for that ATP power to happen. And we might be familiar with those terms. Oxygen is probably one you are familiar with, so we can think of that a little easier. But the glucose is also something that is needed. So the muscle contraction needs glucose and oxygen. Part of what makes our muscles red is the more oxygen that's in our muscle, the redder that muscle is going to be. So that term is the myoglobin. It's the respiratory pigment, but that also is part of the power, part of the oxygen that is going to power that contraction and be part of that energy source that is going to make my muscle move, hopefully, like I want it to do. On page 401, the second paragraph, we also want to look at the stages of the glucose. So perhaps you've heard of that term glucose. So this is just another way that our body is converting something in order to make our muscles fire a little better. So we have anaerobic glycosis and we have aerobic glycosis. So these two terms have to do with the oxygen that is being broken down as part of the glucose. So remember, we also have to have that ATP, but also glucose and oxygen. So be familiar with what anaerobic and aerobic glycosis is, or how that glucose is being broken down and what those need. But all of the energy sources that are powering our muscles can also have the ability to get fatigue in them. So when my nerves are no longer generating enough power or can generate enough power from my muscle, it becomes fatigued. It runs out of oxygen, glucose, ATP, one or all of those things. So that's what muscle fatigue is. But it's a very complex process of what we're taking in so that we don't have that fatigue. I want to look a little closer at the fatiguing of a muscle. So these terms are on page 401, and they can be a little bit confusing, but if we have a little visual perhaps to go with it, maybe that will help. So when a muscle fiber is being created within our body, it is being structured as a type 1 or a type 2, which is also known as a fast twitch or a slow twitch. So a type 1 muscle is one that is going to have a lot of power to it. Type 1 muscles have a little deeper red appearance to it. They're going to have a little bit more oxygen, a little bit more glucose in them. So these are the muscles that we're going to have where in our body. Where do you think that you would have a type 1 muscle within our body or within your body? So I'm going to let you think about that for a moment. Type 2 is where it has a little less coloring to it, so a little less of the glucose, a little less of the oxygen. So it's just a different look to it. So you can think of them as the red muscles and the white muscles. Type 1 is going to be redder. Type 2 is not necessarily going to be white. It's just going to be less red. But that might help you with the terms of the fast twitch and the slow twitch. So our type 1 or our red muscles are our slow twitch muscles. These are the ones that are like in our legs, our lower extremities. They're made to go for a long period of time. Our body is built that we could all go out and run a marathon today. Our muscles can do it. They're made for that. But our type 2 muscles or our white muscles, those are our fast twitch muscles. So these are the ones that are not as strong to last us to run a marathon. If we had to do a marathon on our arms, we would have a lot more muscle fatigue. Our muscles would fatigue a lot quicker. So our type 2 muscle or our white muscles are like our upper arms. They're going to be depleted of that ATP and that oxygen and glucose quicker than our type 1, our red muscles, our slow twitch muscles. So hopefully that helps you with learning the difference between them, but also notice that in yourself. You can walk farther, longer than you could if you were walking on your hands. So now we know that we have bundles of fibers within our muscle. We know that they are being talked to, every bundle, every fascicle is being talked to by a part of our nervous system, and that happens right at that neuromuscular junction. We know that there's a recruitment, an all or none response recruitment that is firing those bundles. And then we have different types of muscles within our body, those type 1 red, the type 2 white, those fast, those slow. But now we need to look at the different types of contractions that can occur or do occur within our body. So this picture is on page 402, and it gives us the definitions also on 402 of the different types of muscle contractions. We have isotonic, which has two subclassifications, to concentric and eccentric. And then we have isometric. So these two type of contractions really seem very complicated, but when you look at that picture on page 402 or on this slide, you can see that they're actually very simple. Isotonic is when the muscle changes length, but it keeps the same tension. And then eccentric is when the muscle lengthens, and concentric is when it shortens. But remember, that only has to do with length, not tension. Isometric is the changing of the tension, but the muscle length does not change. So isometric can also be called static contraction. It doesn't involve movement. So that's just how muscles, every muscle is going to have its own way that it moves. But we also have different shapes, different types of muscles within our body, the different number of joints that they're crossing. But movement is still being produced by our muscles within our joints. So we want to look at the lever system as how all of that is going to be categorized. So first we have the three parts of each part of leverage. We have the load, the pull, and the fulcrum. And then the three classes which are ranging each of those, class 1, class 2, class 3. So look at these pictures. They really are so easy to understand. The definitions of each are on page 403 of each. But if you look at the pictures, I really think that that will help you knowing how to remember each one of these. So the class 3 is the most common in our body. So that's the one with the shovel. So the load, the pull, and the fulcrum, as if I was holding a shovel of dirt. So that's our class 3. And again, the most common type of lever system within our body. But as I mentioned, we have different types of muscle fiber arrangement. So I call this the architecture of how our body is created. We're each created the same. We have the same type of muscles, but each muscle within my body is unique to myself. So these muscle fiber arrangements, this is the picture that's on page 404. Some of the definitions start on page 403, the rest are on 404. Each one of these you absolutely need to know the definition of and an example of. So, for example, a parallel muscle, what that is. So the fibers are running in the same direction, and they're usually tapered at one end, and the sartorius muscle is an example of that. So just what each one of these parallel or fusiform, convergent, spiral, circular, penne. But within the penne, we also have 3 prefixes, uni, bi, and multi. If you don't know what those 3 prefixes are, please refer back to chapter 18 to remember what those are. But each of these muscles are also going to be crossing either 1, 2, or 3 or more joints. So that further gives us the definitions of uniarticular, biarticular, and multiarticular, just defining how many joints that particular muscle fiber is crossing. Those definitions, if you need more, is on page 405. So you can see those at the bottom. But then we also have what's on the top of page 405, but how the actions are classified. So it is a picture that's on the bottom of 405 for our fixator, our prime mover, our synergist, our stabilizer, and our antagonist. Each of these type of muscle actions, these terms, I want you to be familiar with so you can see how they have them divided out in that picture. Antagonist is one that sometimes can be confused with agonist. So a prime mover is an agonist, which is different than an antagonist. Probably terms you're familiar with, but now we're just thinking of them as our muscles instead.